decided to have this forum because so many people, so many ordinary citizens, certainly I was one before we started this, who don't really know what's going on with your police department and what kind of police surveillance they have, they want, they get, they pay for. It all comes under pretty much under the radar. And when you look at some of the Stingray technologies, which are the fake towers, I guess you would say, to capture cell phone information in a circumscribed radius. Some of those, you're not even allowed, the contractor, the manufacturer, do not allow the police department to even admit that they have a Stingray. So it's very, very hush-hush, I guess, as we would say. But the citizenry needs to know about this, and that's what this meeting is for, to help fill in some of the things that we found out and that some of the experts that are here have experience in. So without further ado, I'm going to start with you, in talking in general. Right down here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you to everyone for being present here. It's my distinct pleasure to be part of this conversation and to share this table with Ken and Chris and everybody else here. My name is Mohammed Tagsar. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California. I also happen to be a Pasadena resident, so I'm personally invested, I guess, in a lot of these different issues. What I wanted to sort of briefly talk about just at the outset is just give a little bit of a 30,000-foot view of what exactly we're doing here and what we're talking about in the context of surveillance, and sort of just lay out exactly what I think the problem is, or what the current condition is, and what the problem is that we are facing here as residents of this community and many other communities, sort of locally and nationally as well. And then hopefully we can build on that conversation sort of together and with you all to talk a little bit more about what exactly needs to be done and what can be done as a result of it. So I guess I'd like to start just briefly by talking a little bit about like what exactly we mean by surveillance, right? So I don't know about you all, but when I think of the word surveillance, it's kind of a big word, right? When I think about surveillance, I have this like image of like a Minority Report type situation, right? With like Tom Cruise standing in front of a tall wall that's glass, and he's got like markers, and there's like a big room that has like 4,000 TVs and like a bunch of stuffy dudes in suits who like monitor all kinds of people together. That's kind of what I have. That's my image of surveillance, right? What exactly that means. So what I'd like to do, I guess, tonight is I want to disabuse you and myself, frankly, of that image of surveillance. That's not what I think I want to talk about, and certainly not what I think we ought to be concerned about. So just as on a real basic level, what we mean, I think, when we talk about surveillance is as follows: the government's monitoring of information about individuals and its collection and subsequent use of that information, right? Note, I say the government here, I'm sort of going to table a conversation about corporate and private surveillance, but I think that's a bit of a conversation. But I'll just put that to the side for a second. So just the collection, the monitoring of individuals, both sort of physically, as well as sort of information about individuals, as well as the sort of collection and analysis of this data and its use. That's kind of what we mean, right? So that definition purposely is a really broad one for me, right? That includes all kinds of different stuff. And you might think, well, that actually also includes all manner of different forms of government activity that's long existed in this country and elsewhere. And the answer is that's true, right? This kind of surveillance, basically the gathering and monitoring of individual and collectives, sort of information about individuals and collectives, that's been going on for quite a long time, right? So, what's important or what's interesting about today? Why are we having this conversation if we're talking about a practice that the government has been engaged in since the government has been created, right? I'd like to answer that question and tell you a little bit about why I think, at least in my opinion, this is an important conversation for today. right? Notwithstanding the fact that this form of surveillance has been going on for a long time. So I want to point to 3 reasons why I think we should be concerned about the government's gathering of information about individuals. 3 reasons why we should be concerned about it today in ways that I think are qualitatively different than the ways in which the government has done this before in the past, right? So I see my brother in the front row has a shirt that references COINTELPRO, right? But we're gonna talk a little bit, I hope, about COINTELPRO tonight. But I want to talk about why that was a disastrous sort of program, but why I think we should be more concerned today than we ever were back in the 60s and 70s, right? And that's for 3 reasons, right? So the first reason is that the technology to conduct this kind of surveillance now is orders of magnitude more invasive and captures many more people than it's ever done before, right? What do I mean by that? Why is it more invasive now? So you might think of, so before, it might have been the way that we would capture information about individuals or others, or the way we would know things about each other is by like literally observing them. Like in my eyes, the police officer on the street, right, would walk the beat and say, hey, Mr. Smith lives on this street, Mrs. Rodriguez goes to work at this location, right? That's the kind of surveillance we might have been talking about before. Or maybe we might write police reports and put them in a literal manila folder or somewhere downtown at the station. That's the kind of surveillance we're talking about. If we were particularly sophisticated, we might use a pen register and like kind of old technology to tap people's phones and things like that. What's different today? All that stuff is in place today, right? But the level of invasiveness of the kind of collection that we're talking about today is on a level unparalleled, I think, in the history of sort of government conduct here. So it's invasive in the sense of and across a number of different nodes, right? So first, there's way more information about us, about literally our physical bodies that is available to the state, right? Our physical bodies in the sense of our location, where we are in a particular time, information about what sort of biometric information about our, for instance, DNA, our irises, our fingerprints, that kind of thing, right? Everybody now, most folks now who leave the airport will have a picture of them taken, right? That kind of information that's sort of like biometric, what we consider to be biometric information, we have that. That has proliferated. The collection of that kind of information has proliferated in ways that it hasn't done before. In addition, the collection of our conduct and our speech is, again, orders of magnitude greater than what had occurred before. So, for instance, things that we post online, letters that we write, emails that we read, texts that we send, phone calls that we make, those things are being they're subject or susceptible to collection in ways that have never, in powerful ways that have never really happened in the past, right? In addition, so I think in that sense, you have a feeling for exactly what I mean by the kind of invasiveness of this sort of technology, right? So we can talk about there's all kinds of things. We could run through the list. License plate readers that were mentioned, social media surveillance, use of unmanned drones to survey people's activities, biometric data collection, fingerprints, facial recognition technology, all kinds of stuff, right, that I think is at play today. So that's the first thing. The technology is way more invasive now than it's ever been before, all right? So second difference between today and before, in my eyes, is the amount of information that's collected today is, again, orders of magnitude greater than it's ever been before. Why is that? Well, it is that way because it's incredibly cheap now to collect information than it's ever been before, right? So let me give you an example. Most of the phones that people have here in this room might have something like, might have this storage capacity of, maybe 32 gigabytes or 64 gigabytes of data. Or if you're Neanderthal, like me and my partner, it might have like 8 or 16 gigabytes worth of data, right? So what does that actually mean? Let me put that in some historical context. A gigabyte of data in 1981, how much do you think that cost somebody to store? So 40 years ago, how much did the storage of a gigabyte worth of data cost?
A lot.
Okay. 10,000? I heard 10,000? Okay, so here's a range. It can cost anywhere from $190,000 to $700,000 to store 1 gigabyte worth of data 4 decades ago. All right, how much does it cost today? Maybe 3 cents, 4 cents, right? It basically costs nothing, right? Despite the fact that you pay through the roof for your iPhone, right? But it costs literally nothing to store data. Right? So so the amount of information that's collected is, again, you can literally collect information essentially for free. Right? So that, again, is something that's different. The third thing that's different is, okay, now that we have all this information, we can analyze it in a way more sophisticated fashion than we've ever done before. That is, our processing power, our analytical power over this data is, again, orders of magnitude greater than anything we've ever had before. So let's go back to 1980. This time let's go to 1985, roughly. The fastest supercomputer.
1984.
Oh, that's right. I like it. So, yeah, let's go back to 1984. Well, we can't actually go back to 1984 because my example here requires 1985. So the world's fastest supercomputer in 1985, this thing called the Cray 2, right? The fastest, most capable supercomputer out there. About the size of a small car, right? Used by the military, by NASA, by basically who you'd think would use a massive supercomputer at the time. That thing cost, in today's adjusted for inflation dollar amounts, cost at least $32 million for one. All right, that device has the same computing power. This is a rough technical analogy, but it has the same computing power as one single iPhone 4. Okay. We have more technological computing power in this room than anybody would ever have dreamed of 4 decades ago. But why is that important, right? That's important because all that data that we collected, we can analyze that in incredibly sophisticated ways, in ways that are incredibly harmful for us, right? Or potentially incredibly devastating for people whose information is collected. So that, I think that the way those three forces interact with each other in the different ways that we're going to be talking about today are why I think today's moment is a moment that we should all be concerned about and we should all be thinking about a little bit more, right? So we can talk a little bit more. I'm happy to talk a little more about what exactly the harms are. You might ask, okay, well, you rattle off a whole bunch of stuff, but what does that actually mean? Why is that really important? How does it harm us, right? And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more, but I think this is the kind of context that we're talking about here. And I think it bears repeating that this level of power that we now have is power that can be abused and that we know is being abused in ways that are potentially devastating for all of us, but in particular for those who are the most vulnerable among us.
So I have a timer going, just so I'm very respectful of your time. And I think that's really important to me. It's really valuable to be here with you all and to figure this out together. As it's been said, my name is Ken Montenegro. I'm National Vice President of the National Lawyers Guild. I drove up the road from Boyle Heights, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. I want to start off by recognizing the space that we're in right now. I want to recognize that it's a Quaker, it's a Friends meeting house. I want to hold up the power that the Quakers have had in fighting for political prisoners and anti-apartheid, both in South Africa and in the apartheid state of Israel. I think that's really important because when we're talking about surveillance, what we're really talking about is white supremacy. Yes. We encode it as a legal construct, but what we're really talking about is the preservation of white preference, and we're talking about white supremacy. Surveillance is a form of state violence, because if we look at the history of surveillance, who have been the people who have been surveilled? Surveillance starts off as an exercise against black folks and against natives. Why? Because we wanted to get rid of them as a country. Those are traditional American values. We wanted the creation of an ethno-state, and so therefore, in places like South Carolina, we have self-surveillance, which nowadays, we all have our personal surveillance device, and I love how you broke that down. Saved me so much time. Such a good comrade here. When we have our own personal surveillance device walking with us, in a more egregious way, and in a way that's not funny, is we think about self-surveillance in antebellum South. What did that look like? It looked like the lantern laws, where if a black person was out at night, they had to be carrying a lantern to to identify that they wanted to be seen so that they weren't presumed to be a fugitive, that they weren't on the route to freedom, they were on the route to handle the master's business, which is one of the things within this context as we're having this conversation. At the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, I'm one of the co-founders of that coalition. That coalition really believes in people power as part of this. And it's wonderful to partner with the ACLU in this space because I believe in a diversity of tactics. We need the legal acumen and the wonderful skills of the ACLU and the supporters and members of the ACLU bring to the table. We also need people power. And we need to find the right fusion so that we can work together and beat up this, insert profanity here. And when we're talking about this surveillance, when we look at it as a superstructure, we're really talking about what we call it the coalition, the stalker state. Because like with the stalker, sometimes the stalker is there, sometimes they're not there. You don't know if the stalker is benign or whether the stalker intends to create harm to you. You don't know exactly why they're stalking you, or if you're even being stalked. Is it my imagination, etc.? And I think when we're talking about surveillance, it's very easy and tempting to go to the legal framework, because the legal framework provides some degree of certainty. I'm here to invite you to say, like, wow, that legal framework might not provide a lot of certainty, because when we think of things like the right to privacy and who's impacted by surveillance, we realize it's people who the laws are not really meant to protect. The moment that everyone is outraged is when it's like, oh my God, it's invading my privacy. It's a problem because Edward Snowden said it's a problem, and he's like a really smart, cool white guy who understands this, therefore we all need to freak the hell out. That's not the story. I mean, this is, and with the coalition, one of the other guiding principles we have is the understanding and the sharing and the building that this is not a moment in time. This is a continuation of history. The technologies have changed, but the impetus, the driving forces to this remain one and the same. When we think about things like, and it was wonderful seeing a friend, Melissa, here earlier and talking about the Green Book. When we're talking about immigrants, I really don't like to talk about that. I want us to shift the conversation to migrants, because we have to think about the surveillance and the counter-surveillance measures that black folks had to engage in throughout their entire history. But let's just focus on the Great Migration from the South, when they had to avoid sundown towns, how am I not seen traveling down this highway? And why? Maybe we could say that those are private actors, but private actors are emboldened by what the state's response is. And the state's response is usually to let people who does not want to live to be surveilled and harmed through that surveillance. We think about the Red Scare. That's a lot of surveillance that happened to make the Red Scare possible. And the ACLU did really good work on that. A lot of folks have done good work on that. But let's remember, once again, not a moment in time, a continuation of history. COINTELPRO. Like the Lawyers Guild has a project on COINTELPRO because we believed, and we still strongly believe, that if folks are fighting for their lives and fighting for liberation, we're not going to say, oh, is your activity constitutional as a framework to we're going to be on your side and protect you. We're like, hey, if you're fighting for your liberation and fighting against fascism, we're going to throw down and we're going to be with you. But let's remember, we can all say it together, not a moment in time, a continuation of history. Then we go to the Green Scare, environmental activists. A lot of folks who were jammed up by surveillance. They were jammed up by infiltration. So let's also, I think it's important to demystify the role of technology. Technology isn't the only vehicle for surveillance. Sometimes we can be the vehicles for surveillance. When you see something like the suspicious activities reporting, see something, say something. So the work that you folks are doing, which is great against against countering violent extremism, that's really important work. Because what we're also fighting here is how do we fight back the narrative that we need to be agents of the stalker state, that we need to be part of like this snitching culture, because thinking that snitching is going to keep us, safe, whatever that means to whoever it means something. And then we talk about the landscape, the impact on immigrants. When even thinking outside the framework of good migrant, bad migrant, etc., we're seeing these technologies deployed to snatch people up on their way home to their loved ones in a very strategic, intentional, disruptive way where it makes it very difficult for communities to fight back. And I think that's one of the aspects of the stalker state, returning to that framework. You don't know when your stalker is going to strike you. Your stalker might get you at your office. Your stalker might get you in the parking lot. You don't know. Similarly, when we see these interventions of we're going to snatch immigrants, they're leveraging all these technologies to do that. And you really can't trust the cops. Like, let's just be real about that.
Yes.
We think about the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, how they were illegally surveilling Compton with drones, and when they got caught, I think you folks did some good work on that, where it's like, oopsie, yeah, I guess we should have asked. That doesn't make it better. We have all these unidentified planes. There's a wonderful article I was able to participate and be part of that, Spies in the Skies, that BuzzFeed put out maybe 2 years ago, maybe started last year, where there was an analysis of air traffic in the Los Angeles basin of government aircraft. And so you have every three-letter agency has aircraft flying over LA, some of it is on contract, which goes to the area that you, Mohammed, correctly identified as a rabbit hole of what is the nexus of government surveillance, government stalking, and private corporations.
Yes.
One of the more insidious aspects is how private corporations are selling this data, and how, at least in my estimation, that's a legal end run in some cases, because they're not collecting the data at the behest of the state. The state is actually purchasing that data. But by purchasing that data, without having to get a warrant, they can effectively know where was Ken's phone, what towers did it use, because, you know, T-Mobile can be generous in the wrong ways. And so when we think of all these things, I think it's also important to highlight who are the canaries in this surveillance coal mine. It's natives, it's black folks, it's poor folks. Think of the amount of surveillance that poor people have to, with no option whatsoever, subject themselves to be in public housing. Think of the amount of surveillance that someone who's going for public benefits has to subject themselves to. Now we're really talking about, that's the canary, and that's the future if we don't fight back, the normalization of these practices. And it's easy to say, well, I'm not black, I don't have the melanin that some people do in their skin, therefore it's all good, like, it won't happen to me. What tends to happen, and what history has shown us, is that there's this gradual encroachment. And that's one of the reasons why I think this fight against surveillance is so important. For those of you who are kind of like legal nerds, y'all love the ACLU. The ACLU has like some wonderful stuff, and just thinking about, and from a constitutional framework, this stuff is, so I'm speaking from like a human rights framework. If we go to the constitutional aspects, that's actually super scary, because we think of when we are living in the stalker state, what are the First Amendment's implication of our freedom of association if we know we're being watched? From a Fourth Amendment standpoint, the implications of, wow, suddenly the Fourth Amendment, which we're like, oh, that's only for criminals, it's like, oh, unlawful search and seizure, where we don't even know that stuff has been seized, and you folks have done just wonderful litigation, especially on the national security front, around that issue of, hey, I think the government's watching me. Oh, you have to prove you know the government's watching you for you to litigate that the government's watching you, etc. Fifth Amendment, the right not to self-incriminate. So is my phone, by collecting data, incriminating me? I don't know. That's my time. The Sixth Amendment, presentation of evidence, that's also something that we often don't think about, where when we think about, when we talk about things like parallel construction, where there's a set of data that's collected about you, that's used by law enforcement to jam you up, but then you go to court and the state will not disclose they collected data. They would rather let a case go than disclose, like, oh yeah, we were illegally spying on you. And so when we think about this, I think always coming back to not a moment in time, a continuation of history. How do we fight it? A diversity of tactics and people power, which is what you folks are doing here tonight. By being part of this chapter, you're creating people power. By engaging in these conversations, that's what people power looks like. And also, I think that it's important, like I said earlier, if we're trying to focus on migrants, to think of who are we leaving out of these conversations? How much of our conversation ignores issues of gender and ability and the implications thereof, and the danger of silence. That's all I got to say for now.
Thank you. I'll spend the next 30 minutes asking questions to both of our speakers, and then I open it up to questions from all my. So, my first question is, what are the most worrisome government mass surveillance technologies currently, and why do you think they are. So, whoever wants to start.
I think the collusion aspect of technology, so the ability of the government to purchase commercial data sets and not be clear about what they're purchasing and what they're using that for, is, to me, one of the most dangerous and concerning areas of this discussion.
And could you just explain what are commercial data sets for those of us that have not?
Yeah, so a lot of folks know of like databases like, let's say, Lexis, Westlaw, Dun Bradstreet, etc. So ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, actually has a contract where they are able to use that data to kind of fill in the blanks, if you will, of people that they're interested in. So that type of collusion is very dangerous. When we're talking about automated license plate readers, so there are repo companies collect that data. So they have ALPRs that like go through the streets and collect data, especially in poor neighborhoods like Boyle Heights. And there are the probation department. Apparently, there's a California Law Journal or Criminal Law Journal article from about 2 years ago that expresses concern over the ability to purchase that data because they're already collecting it for repo purposes, but now law enforcement can look at that as well. So that's what I'm talking about. And like at a more simple level, let's just think about Facebook data. So when Facebook, or when, like, let's say a 3-letter agency wants to look at Facebook data to create, like, let's say a human terrain or a human network map of who you know, where you go, etc., how they don't really need to tell you. That process is just so obfuscated, especially if it's someone who has access to the data set that Facebook has. Once upon a time, that would have been Palantir who had that direct access. That's what worries me.
Yeah, just a big piggyback on that. I mean, I think to me, one of the most worrisome sort of technologies that I think the governments are being able to deploy is the surveillance of our digital lives, right? So part of what I think the problem, Ken sort of pointed this out, that part of the problem with this kind of surveillance technology is that it inhibits our ability to sort of like act collectively or to organize, and frankly just to be in public space, right? Like what we think of as public space is essentially shrunk, right? There's no more commons anymore because everywhere we go, the stalker is essentially following us, right? So what do we, what does like liberal America think is the sort of solution to literally eroding public sphere? Well, it says, look, go online, right? We're having all these robust conversations on Twitter and Facebook about all this other stuff, right? The problem is that those conversations aren't nearly, for the reasons I think Ken alluded to, they're not nearly as robust and protected as we think they are. And to me, one of the most troubling aspects, a troubling development is just how easy it is for the state to survey our activities online, right, in ways that I think are potentially devastating, right? And so we know that this has happened because it's been in the news that it's happened, right? So it also happens here in Pasadena. So what do I mean by that kind of surveillance? So for instance, just monitoring the use of hashtags. Right, so we know that this occurs. There are companies who peddle this service, this like social media monitoring to law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement agencies turn around and buy them, and what they're able to do is basically see who uses a particular hashtag and identify them as potentially suspect. Right, so BLM, Black Lives Matter, is this has occurred repeatedly to folks who are involved in the Black liberation movement across the country, where just the use of that hashtag BLM, is itself a cause for their surveillance by these companies that basically scrape social media information and turn that over and hand it to police. And I think that creates a real problem for us because it basically inhibits our ability, I think this is true, it inhibits our ability to really organize even digitally, right, let alone organize sort of physically. So for me, I'm quite concerned about how even in the areas in which we think we have some modicum of privacy, some modicum of control over our own sort of autonomy and ability, activity, the elements of the state, sort of like the tentacles of the state, as it were, are sort of wrapped around those as well. To say nothing of what exactly Facebook and Twitter do with that information. That's like its own sort of potential problem. So I think to me, that's a really concerning thing. And that actually happens right here in Pasadena. So if I may, Chris alluded to the contract that the city of Pasadena has with a company called Spokio. Right? Spokio is essentially a data aggregation service. It collects records about individuals and throws them up online. If you type your name in Spokio, all manner of different information about you will come up. And that information includes your social media activity. So whereas you might think that the police department shouldn't have literally have a file at City Hall about everything that you post online that's public, and everything about your real estate records and voter registration records and health records and all that stuff, they shouldn't have that stuff physically in City Hall. They don't. What they actually do is have Spokio collect it for you, and then they just tap it. Right? That's happening right now. And it's a real problem, I think, for all the reasons that I think Ken mentioned. So.
Another question. What's the future of government surveillance look like, and what should we be watching for? Or is it all over the world?
Sorry, crystal ball time. What is the future of surveillance?
I trust you on this.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that Trump picture of your.
I can't tell you. So I think that this builds on what you were saying about Spokio, where I think that one of the big dangers is the normalization. That's the future. Because I think that when we have practices that are harmful, sometimes these practices become so ingrained in our everyday lives that they become normalized. That's just kind of like the way that we roll, and we kind of give up on things like the fight against surveillance. I think that that's, for me, one of the battles in the future will be how do we continue to demystify what we're talking about? Because I think that there is a tendency to ask the lawyers to have an answer to this problem, when this is not a problem that is a legal problem. This is a problem with white supremacist society. When we ask activists, how are you going to fight surveillance? But usually what's offered to activists is, encrypt your phone. And for me, as someone who's a technologist first and a lawyer second, for me, I'm like, the answer is not technology. We're not going to fight technology with technology. We're going to fight it with people power, because it's the only way we're going to do it. When we talk about, are my devices encrypted, I worry about those conversations, because I'm like, who's left out of those conversations? Who doesn't have the ability or the comfort to engage in these actions? So my fear, if I have to name one in the future, is a fragmentation where just like privacy is now, where this conversation is surveillance is afforded to some while others are free from it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think I agree with Ken absolutely. As like a lawyer here who works at the ACLU, I mean, I think for me the law probably, if I was to give a rough estimate, probably solves about maybe 10% of this problem. Maybe you can sort of tackle the issue kind of around the edges and create some limits here and there, maybe they're meaningful, maybe they're not. But really the fight, I think, and as this is the case with most of the law, the fight really is in the courthouse, right? Basically, the fight's in the street. So I think that bears, notwithstanding the fact that I'm a lawyer and that's what I do by trade, I think that's actually right. The things that sort of, I guess the future, I think Ken mentioned a number of these, and I think I want to repeat them. So first, I think just increased private-public partnerships in the context of surveillance, I think to me are likely to be in the future. Just because there's just a general disinvestment in the public sort of sector as a general matter, and that I think it's increasingly the case that the private sector is doing the work that the cops and the FBI and the 3 other agencies used to do in the past. For any number of different reasons. It's cheaper, it's easier, legal loopholes, all manner of different reasons. But I think that really is where the technology is going. So Spokio is a good example of that. Automatic license plate readers, also a great example of that. Who maintains and collects information about automatic license plate readers? The primary game in town is this company called Vigilant Solutions. They maintain these databases. And what does the government do? It taps that information. So ICE doesn't have to do that work of collecting all this work. The private company does that, and then ICE just comes around and says, all right, great, now that you've got it, let me see what you got. Let me go after some of these immigrants, right? So that, I think, is really worrisome. I think another thing that's worrisome is just information sharing. Just generally, how much information is shared across the board in state, between the state, the local municipalities, the feds, private companies, information that you might give in the kind of your public benefits application ends up being used against you in court, in some kind of criminal proceeding, or ends up being part of your A file, right? If you're an immigrant, or whatever it is, like what you might think of as a sort of distinct like nugget about your life is something that ends up being like metastasizes in this way across all manner of different sort of places, and I think that's really troubling. The last thing I think, this is actually I think really also important to highlight before I go. One last thing is, it's not just police that we're talking about, right? So part of what organizations like the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, National Lawyers Guild, a whole bunch of other people are really concerned about, is that this kind of technology is being deployed, particularly now, across all sectors of public life, right? Y'all have heard about smart cities, right? It's sort of a kind of a basic like sort of term used to talk about sort of the use of data and technology to benefit the dispersal of public services and benefits in cities across the country, right? So automating things like bus routes and all kinds of other different stuff. Basically, the pervasiveness of technology to do some public sector work. There are a lot of surveillance implications of that I think are really, frankly, not very understood or focused on. And I think it's kind of I fear that it will do exactly what Ken is talking about, which is normalize sort of the monitoring and collection of information about individuals across all sectors of the government in ways that we think, in ways that we are completely either oblivious to or passively think is okay. Well, what's a good example? I mean, so
bill reform. Talk about bill reform for a second. The algorithms.
Sure. I don't know. So let's see. So let's see. What do I have in mind? So, for instance, just thinking about, for instance, I use the traffic. Right. That's a good example. I guess that's a good way of doing it. So, the smart cities various forms of technology is being deployed to supposedly try to ease the problem of traffic. Right. Using data to figure out where cars go, how they travel, maximize how you can flick red lights to green lights in ways that optimize the amount of cars and travel while doing all this kind of work. All of that requires a massive amount of data collection about people's activity, like transportation habits and things like that. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is if you don't have either strict controls on that on the kind of analysis that's being conducted, and if you, for instance, share information across government agencies, you can actually end up having, just like with automatic license plate readers, a real invasive portrait of where people go, how they move, what mechanisms they use to travel from place to place, where they stop, where they go, right? All in the name of improving your traffic, right? So I think we have to be vigilant and say, look, we want we want good tools to solve real social problems that impact the most vulnerable among us. But we also need to be vigilant and make sure that in the process of doing this, we understand what we're actually getting ourselves into. So,
short answer, fusion centers are useless, and yes, they pose a very big threat.
What he said.
So a fusion center, just as the name implies, in some places they're called where the Joint Terrorism Task Force are housed. It's a multi-agency resource or location. One of the near ones here is in Norwalk. The Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, with the help from the Lawyers Guild, shut down the fusion center for a day because it's fun to cause trouble. And so what they do is it's a waste of money. There's a center report that demonstrates how the fusion centers provide no real value. But it's a place where data is aggregated and studied. The funniest type of data that's studied there is open source data, which is cops sitting around watching the TV and writing down what they saw on the TV. So fusion centers are really, the design of the fusion center is they're supposed to be kind of the nexus or the hub where all this intelligence analysis and gathering happens. That still kind of happens there, but the usefulness has not been shown in any quantifiable way.
Why is it a problem?
Oh, why is it a problem? Because it goes to the issue of and I love the fact that you raised it, because I'm forgot. The danger of the information sharing environment. I think that this provides a hub where the sheriff, the LAPD, the Coast Guard, and all the three-letter law enforcement agencies, or agencies, let's just call them, pump all their data into the fusion center so that there can be some analysis done, but no one's really clear about where does this data go. So does the JRIC or the JTTF JRIC in the Bay Area, they can access the SoCal data, and vice versa. So it's this so fusion centers are actually work on a network. And so therefore, data that we believe is collected or that is said to be collected for local use, ostensibly can be disseminated at a greater breadth. Yeah, both up and down and laterally. Yeah.
How can you tell if your cell phone privacy is being or has been violated?
Oh God, I don't know. Can you handle it?
Technical expert. I don't know. Can you? Let's. I guess one way to backing up here. So, when I think of surveillance, real quick, it's one way to think about it, or to sort of differentiate into forms of surveillance. At least sometimes it helps me think about them a little bit more. It's thinking about sort of what I consider to be targeted forms of like monitoring or scrutiny, as opposed to something that's more dragnet forms of surveillance or scrutiny, sort of mass, like en masse scrutiny and collection of information. So with anything like a private, like any information about you that you have, whether that's information contained in a cell phone or like your computer, or information like physical information in your records and things, one can imagine that the state can access that information through a form of targeted like monitoring or surveillance of you, or through a broader en masse data collection program that hoovers up basically everybody. So depending on what kind of tool or system the government is using, it can access your information on your cell phone or private devices in different ways using different tools. So for instance, it's quite if you are the form of some kind of like targeted action by the government. So if there is a warrant out for a search warrant that has your name on it, the government thinks you've done something wrong, there's basically nothing you can really do to stop the government from coming and searching all of your electronic devices and all information about you. If you really are the subject of of an investigation, either locally or nationally, it's quite hard to really impede that level of investigation. And there may be legal problems with doing that. To me, I think the more worrisome problem is not the targeted form of like government state action, but the broad, en masse sort of like dragnet forms of surveillance that occur every day. And I think that is quite hard. That's often done in secret in ways that are technically complex and in ways that impact everybody in sort of equally across the board. And there's often no way to really know that your stuff has been susceptible to that. I mean, we have a basic sense that generally speaking, your metadata, metadata that concerns your communications that you have on your cell phone is generally in the hands of the NSA or some other government agency. That's generally true. It's often the case that the content of your communications itself, right, so the content of your emails and like text and things also are in some government database. It potentially, depending on who you're talking to, different things, just as a matter of a kind of broad-based data collection program. All of that unbeknownst to you, or sort of unbeknownst to you, I guess, we sort of get little bits and pieces of information here and there about what the government does, and often that information is from like 6 years ago when like who knows what they're doing now, you know? So I guess my long answer to your short question, Chris, is I don't know. I think, yes, they do it, and we have to sort of be mindful that with kind of the proliferation of these devices, as Kim was talking about, these are kind of handheld sort of monitoring devices that the government can tap basically whenever it wants. Sorry.
Thank you, Sunshine.